Tom, the offers to help come from across the nation. 11,000 medical personnel volunteering their services. 700,000 people calling the Red Cross to donate blood. But the heart of the response is here in New York City. To the rest of the world, New Yorkers are a tough, brusque crowd. And there's none tougher than Dave Bryant, an iron worker from Queens, who gave up his night to come and try to free people from under thousands of tons of rubble.
There must be 60 fire trucks that are totally destroyed.
His goal, to help people like Eva Narula.
Somebody has to fight.
Today, desperately searching for her 22-year-old sister, Monica, who worked on the 101st floor of Tower Number 1. Volunteers pass food and water to those hungry for information. One of them, bereavement specialist Ellen Gorman.
And I think that that's the way everybody feels. I think they don't know what to do, and they don't know where to go. And I think it is, in fact, helpful for people to do something.
For thousands of New Yorkers, their answer, to give blood. So many donors, the New York Blood Center turns people away.
We will still need your blood next week.
Two friends of Dino Rinaldi are missing.
You give blood, you sit back, you volunteer, you do what you can.
At the James Beard House, they do what they do best, cook. Known as the Carnegie Hall for chefs, now it's a collection point for donations from local restaurants.
You know, half hour, 350 degrees. It's warm now, but if you want to really heat it up.
The food usually served in some of New York's best dining rooms, including Babbo and Le Cirque, today feeding doctors, nurses, and rescue workers.
Food is nurturing. We want to help nurture the people who are out there giving strength to others.
And today, a new appreciation for the men and women known as New York's bravest and finest. New Yorkers applauding along the West Side Highway as rescuers return to the attack site. A few blocks away from the terror, Jackie Fanasoulis turns her restaurant into a guest house for 9 people.
We let people sleep in our restaurant. There were couples that could not get back to their home.
New Yorkers who pride themselves on having seen it all, today seeing sights they wish never to see again.
How would you describe the scene?
Looks like apocalypse now. I mean, I was in Vietnam as a Marine, and I have never in my life seen anything even remotely close to what I saw there.
As the saying goes, there are 8 million stories in this city. Tonight, so many small acts of kindness, the best in New York brought out by the worst in mankind. Tom?
Thank you very much, NBC's Ann Thompson tonight. Now, for all of us, the hard part, the consequences of this war on terrorism that has been executed against the United States. The terrible task of recovering and counting the dead and honoring them for what they are. Innocent civilians who were executed by zealots only because they were in America in the wrong place at the wrong time. For the president and his advisors, the identification of the terrorists and their sponsors, and then the battle plan. It will require the diplomatic support of not just our well-known allies, but the support as well of other powerful nations, China and Russia. Once that is in place, find the perpetrators and strike back hard. No military operation is ever easy, and this one, very likely in very hostile territory against an elusive enemy, will be especially challenging, and more American lives could be lost. So difficult times are ahead in this land of liberty and devastation tonight. That's Nightly News for now. We'll have continuing coverage on this NBC station. Brian Williams will be here. Some stations will be returning to their local news. I'll see you tonight at 8 Eastern Time for continuing coverage.
This is a News 10 NBC special report. America under siege.
And good evening, everyone. I'm Brian Martin. I'm Gabe Dalmuth. We interrupt NBC's coverage to bring you this special 10 NBC report tonight. Obviously, everyone is talking about this horrible tragedy. You have heard what the news is. Now, we want to hear what your thoughts are. We invite you to call us. Number on your screen, 325-4444. We will take those calls live on the air tonight during this broadcast.
But first, we'd like to update you on the day's news. There has been another collapse in New York City. The stump of the south building of the World Trade Center, the bottom 4 stories have now collapsed. Police have been evacuating some of the rescue workers from the area. No immediate injuries have been reported. And let's go right now to Brett Davidson, who is standing by live in Washington to tell us what's going on there. Brett?
Well, Gabe, dusk is starting to take hold here in Washington, D.C., and the recovery efforts will continue into the night over at the Pentagon. But Defense Department officials say they do not expect to find any survivors in the rubble. This afternoon, President Bush toured the destruction, getting a first-hand look at the cavernous hole in the building caused by terrorist hijackers. The fire is out now, but earlier today, smoke billowed from the collapsed areas on the southwestern side as firefighters used water cannons while perched on ladders to douse the charred building. As the smoke cleared, you got a better sense of the damage. Many Pentagon employees did return to work today, and there were many spectators who came just to look outside of the Pentagon, some bringing flags to show their patriotism. And there were some who waited and watched, hoping for word of a loved one, like Tracy Rowenhorst, whose husband Eddie is still unaccounted for.
My greatest hope is that he comes out unscathed, maybe a cut, a bruise, something like that. And of course my worst fear is going home and telling my kids he's not coming home.
If there is any encouraging news tonight here out of Washington, it is that the number of dead inside the Pentagon will likely be much lower than the worst projections of yesterday. Pentagon officials say it will likely be closer to 100 than the 800 that was estimated yesterday. Reporting live in Washington, D.C., Brett Davidson, News 10 NBC.
Brett, you've been down there for most of actually all of today and some of yesterday. What's the mood like? I mean, you've been walking around, talking to people. Is it just as much of a shock to people there as it was, of course, down in New York City and up here in Rochester?
Yeah, there's still definitely a sense of shock, but it was much different today, Gabe. There was a sense that people were trying to get back to a sense of normalcy. We saw people jogging in the park. Most people went back to work here in Washington, D.C., but it is much different. You know, one thing I noticed here, it is an eerie kind of quiet here. What somebody pointed out to me is that usually during the course of the day and the evening, you will hear airplanes overhead all day long with Reagan National and Dulles Airport not far from here. But as you can hear, there are no airplanes, of course, because the airports remain closed.
And I noticed some emergency vehicles near the Washington Monument. I'm assuming business is not normal right now.
No, business is not normal. There is definitely a much larger police presence all around the monuments, around the White House. It is much tighter security around the national monuments here in Washington, D.C.
Davidson reporting live for us tonight from Washington. Thanks.
Now we want to take you back to New York City, where another collapse in New York City has just occurred. Another building, the bottom south part, the stump of the south building, rather, the bottom 4 stories of the World Trade Center has collapsed. We're going to join Shelley Rubando now live in New York City with the very latest. Shelley?
On camera. Go.
Well, Gabe, for a while this afternoon, it got quiet around here, and just about, you missed it, about 5 minutes ago, a lot of ambulances were coming up this way. We're actually at the lower end of Manhattan, not far from the World Trade Center. Of course, with the third collapse of another building this afternoon, we're hearing that could be why so many ambulances are staying in this general area. We'll keep you posted on that. As for earlier today, it was quite a different scene than what you're seeing now. Down as we got closer to the World Trade Center area, we saw people blocking everyone off.
We're in video.
Okay, I'm not sure if you could hear the police officer there, but he was addressing people trying to get down that street, which would bring you even closer to the World Trade Center. But what we were told is everyone was blocked off. Everybody had to wear masks. We weren't wearing masks, unfortunately, but as you can see by looking at the people around, people were breathing rather heavily. They were coughing. Their throat was irritated, their eyes. Later on in the day, this was. If this doesn't symbolize a country pulling together, I don't know what does. We caught up a lot of people carrying around flags, like this man in particular. And then a Rochester native who we talked to later on in the day recounted how he thinks neighbors are feeling tonight, a day later.
I'm getting some anger. I'm getting a little fear. It subsided a little bit since yesterday. So everybody gets the feeling that it's over for now.
And of course, we'll continue to monitor the situation right here from New York City. Coming up tonight, live at 11, we'll talk to somebody from Rochester's Rural Metro Ambulance who we had a chance to talk to a little earlier today. Reporting live from Manhattan, Shelley Rabando, News 10, NBC.
All right, Shelley, reporting live in New York. Thanks very much.
Flights nationwide are still grounded, and Rochester's airport remains closed at this hour. The FAA is mandating new security measures that will almost certainly mean added delays for the flying public. Local airport administrator Terry Slaybaugh says there will no longer be any curbside check-in, and only ticketed passengers will be allowed through security checkpoints to the gates. Rochesterians are sending their thoughts, prayers, and many other material things to those mostly affected by this tragedy. There are many services going on at this hour. We join Kristen Salome live at the Good Shepherd Church on East Henrietta Road. Kristen?
That's right, Gabe. In fact, as I've been driving around the greater Rochester area today, I've noticed a lot of signs like the one right here announcing impromptu prayer services, just like the one that just broke up here at the Good Shepherd Church in Henrietta. Dozens of people came out to pray this evening and last evening as well, and the same thing, as you said, is going on at dozens of churches around the area. The pastor here tells me the services are in response to the many calls they've been getting from people expressing their need to come together, to grieve, and to try to make sense of this national tragedy. Now that the shock is subsiding, the one emotion that many people here are expressing is anger.
Actually, this is the third time I've been here in 2 days. Yes. And it's to try to properly handle the grief and the anger, and to understand that the best way to deal with this is with compassion and forgiveness.
Now, I asked Father Steve Lape of the church here for some words of wisdom tonight, and he said, excuse me, to find God in the brave work of the rescuers in New York City, and also to look for sense in the words of God, not in the acts of men. Reporting live from Henrietta, Kristen Salome, News 10, NBC.
Kristen, thank you very much. You can find out about other services in our area. There's a complete list on our website, 10nbc.com. And we thought that it would be nice to get your reaction, your response to all of this, and we are now ready to take your phone calls on the air live.
Yeah, as we said in the very beginning, we've talked a lot about the information, a lot about the news. Now it's time to hear what you think about the terrorist attacks. Let's go right to the phones now, and first we've got Chauncey from Pittsford. Chauncey's a Master Sergeant Military Intelligence Detachment. He works in the Military Intelligence Detachment. Chauncey, thanks for joining us. I understand you're concerned about the lack of intelligence in this whole ordeal. You want to talk about that?
Yes, sir. We usually get briefed right away on intelligence oversight, and Congress has mandated that we cannot do intelligence work on certain domestic groups, since we're a military a unit, and I find it quite frustrating, and I hope that the intel people don't take the blame or the hit for this.
You're saying that your hands are tied in many ways.
In many ways, yes, sir. And some ways rightly so, but on the other hand, there seems to be some protection for terrorists and people to control the money, and this I don't think is right.
Speaking of intelligence, should the U.S. have gotten intelligence about something like this that was to happen?
It's very tough. General Schwarzkopf did emphasize, and some other people have emphasized, that the human is not on the ground. Of course, they're tough groups to penetrate, but it can be done, and it should be done. I think really, to cut to the chase here, this is worse than Pearl Harbor because they targeted civilians directly, where the Japanese tried to avoid that. And Yamamoto said that I fear we've woken a sleeping giant, and they have. You know, this is war.
Well, Chauncey of Pittsburgh, thank you very much for calling in to us. Hundreds of you have also written us, email to us to express your shock and grief. For instance, Frank Suervo writes, shocked is not strong enough. I immigrated to this country over 40 years ago from a place where I saw military airplanes over my home. I never thought I would see them over New York City. The devastation and loss of life is appalling. Now is the time for George Bush to show us what he is made of and go after those cowards and rid this country and this world of terror. Let everyone say a prayer for the victims and their families. Let all our enemies find out what happens when you tread on us. God bless America. All right, we understand that we have Arowana from Rochester on the phone with us, and you just cannot understand what has happened. You're in shock and disbelief.
Yes, I am. I just don't understand terrorism. I'll never be able to understand it. I would also like to make a statement that my family, friends, and I send condolences to those who and their loved ones who lost relatives yesterday. Also, best wishes for a speedy recovery to those who are hospitalized. This tragedy is so unreal. It's a disaster that just never should have taken place.
And you obviously are very emotional about this, as all of us are.
Yeah.
Yes, so many lives were lost unnecessarily, and as I said, I'll never be able to understand why.
Really difficult to put into words. Arowana, thank you very much for the phone call. Back to some more emails. We're going to talk about what Crystal wrote to us. She says, I am somewhat lost for words and in much shock. I feel for those who had to live through it and wonder what lies ahead. I would like to send my love and my prayers to the families who have lost a loved one. God bless. From Crystal. We've got Paul now on the phone. Paul's from Pittsburgh. Paul, you're still in disbelief. I understand you originally from England, but you did used to live in New York City. Tell us about your perspective on this whole thing.
You know, I've been in terrorist situations before where the IRA had hit. And, you know, there's always just this overwhelming fear and anger and rage and helplessness. But this, to see the Twin Towers go down, the feeling was just amplified a million times. And you just oscillate back and forth between being helpless and rage. I mean, I really, at times over the last 30 or 40 hours, just been thinking, you know, I want to see an utter and complete eradication of all entities that cause this sort of terror. I mean, you know, you don't want to take it from a racial perspective or a national perspective, but you think, you know, this wild Muslim faction, you want to see them eliminated.
Are you in agreement with the British government in having taken the steps it took yesterday just to make sure that there are no terrorist attacks from the skies over London?
I'm in complete agreement. I listened to the statement by Tony Blair. I thought I thought he assembled his thoughts very well. It was very passionate and from the heart, but it was very intelligent. And some of the upper military officials who talked about you know, very swift action, but that needed to be, you know, of substance. It needed to be final action, not these pinpoint strikes.
So you've had enough, and you want some large-scale action of some sort.
I really have. I mean, I have 3 small children, and for the first time in my life, I looked at them yesterday and said, "Oh my God, what sort of world have I brought them into?" And I, you know, I think this world has a future, but I think we really need to get beyond this sort of mentality existing in it.
Paul from Pittsburgh, thank you very much for calling in tonight.
Thank you, Paul. Another viewer, we have an email who writes, as a young teacher originally from the New York City area, I'm saddened, numb, and in a dreamy state. Al writes, I have yet to find a word that accurately describes this, as Paul almost talked about there. Tragedy, catastrophe, heartbreak. Don't even begin to reflect what this means.
We have another viewer email right now. My thoughts are completely with the victims and their families. I know, however, that the United States as a whole will find some way to pull through this terrible event. And not sure exactly what that email, who that email is from, but we appreciate the viewer writing to us. Here's another email from Tara. I feel very scared. Just can't believe that this is happening to us, America. I just pray that this ends. And let's hear from Patricia right now, who's just called in to us. Patricia?
Hello.
How are you?
Go ahead.
What is your reaction to what's happened the last couple of days?
Shock, fear, wonder, and sadness.
You are worried that these are just faceless people who are ready to attack at any time?
Yeah, they're cowards. I mean, they're basically cowards, like other people have said, and I just wonder how much farther they're going to go, how long is it going to last, and what do we tell our children?
Yeah. How many children? Do you have children at home?
I have 4 children.
What do you tell them, Patricia?
I try and tell them that everything's going to be okay without really believing it. I tell them that I'm going to keep them safe, which I tell them every day, and that that the United States is here to protect us.
Do they ask about it? What kind of questions do they have about this?
Why did it happen? Who did it? And a lot of questions about the families.
All very good questions. A very difficult time.
Yes.
We are going to go on to more emails. Patricia, thank you very much for calling in to us, and we do appreciate your thoughts. We have an email from Jenny and Carolyn. They write, as Canadian citizens, we are shocked that something so tragic is happening so close to us, and can't help but feel some fear that the terrorist activity may hit us as well up in Canada, she says. We feel so much sadness for all American citizens who have been affected by this tragedy, and offer the most sincere condolences to you all. And of course, we have some viewers up in Canada who are sharing all this grief and fear.
Here's another viewer who writes, in my 43 years, I have never seen or heard of any event this bad. My thoughts and prayers are to the relatives or friends on the planes and for the others who have been injured. This rare occasion has caused turmoil all across the nation, and I believe we will fight back. We will get through this and regain our nation's great prosperity and realize our nation is indeed the greatest nation on earth.
Brian, we have Javier on the phone with us, Javier from Rochester, and we understand you're concerned about Osama bin Laden and future terrorist activities that he might launch.
Yeah, well, first of all, I want to extend my condolences to the families, and here in our household, our prayers go out to the victims in this tragedy. Now back to the prime suspect. He's been linked to past attacks on the U.S., the 93 WTC bombing, the embassies in attacks in Africa, and also the attack on the USS Cole. And given the fact that he's been training people in the Middle East and has followers that he has trained and are willing to die for him that are also here in the United States.
Well, that's the most disconcerting part of all this, is it not? That many of the people who are harboring these people, helping them, are not only residents here in the U.S., but possibly some of them are American citizens.
Which is definitely a major concern, because as you had mentioned with the previous person you spoke to, faceless. We don't know who these people are, you know. And I mean, one of the biggest concerns that I have is, do they intend on turning the United States into a battleground as they do in the Middle East? You know, fighting from street corner to street corner. So, assuming this bin Laden person involved, what is his next move? I mean, this seems to be the beginning of something very big. So it's extremely fearing.
Well, obviously, this whole issue of preventing terrorism is now on the front burner of our policy, our government's policy. Javier, we thank you very much for calling in tonight.
Thank you indeed. Speaking of which, the AP is reporting that this one law enforcement official who says this could have been the result of several terrorist kingpins working together. We are investigating that possibility. So there has not been any sort of finger pointing on specifically direct link of exactly who is responsible for this, at least yet.
As far as the man himself is concerned, he says, come and get me. I don't really care if I'm killed or taken out, because there are all these followers around the world who are ready to take up the cause.
Still obviously very early, so the investigation continues. Back to some more emails. Denise writes, it brings tears to my eyes thinking about the victims, and my thoughts and prayers are with them and their families.
Lenora writes this, I find it very scary. I do hope the persons responsible are caught and punished. We need to wake up and increase our military services. I fully support President Bush.
Another viewer writes, this is America. This kind of horror isn't supposed to happen here.
It's one of the things that we talked about, that sense of vulnerability. And there's some more of that email. I'm truly saddened, angered by the cowardly acts against innocent people in this country. My hugs and prayers go out to all the many families who have lost loved ones. My prayers especially to men and women who put their lives on the line each and every day to save people, the firefighters, paramedics, police. This has been a huge wake-up call to my generation. We have lived in a bubble for a long time, thinking this could never happen in this country. I pray this does not ever happen again. That's from Susie, and You're absolutely right,
Wow.
and we've taken for granted perhaps our freedoms and our security. In this
Yeah, I think so. We're going to go now to Eric from Rochester. Eric thinks that we need to revise our immigration laws a little bit. Eric, talk about that.
How you doing this evening?
Doing
Brian
fine,
and
thanks.
Dave?
How are you?
Okay. I would like to lead in by saying, first and foremost, I love America, every square inch of it. And on behalf of my family, our most sincere, deepest, heartfelt sympathy to all the victims, their immediate and extended families, relatives, associates, and friends. Not for 1 second do I believe this is a race issue, but a people issue. It is all the policies and freedoms that make us so great, that make us so vulnerable.
All right, Eric, who has suggested that this is a racial issue?
I do a couple of call-in shows a week, and I hear feedback from people in the community.
Mm-hmm.
And
because it's not even, we're not even talking about Islam necessarily. We're talking about a band of radicals who perhaps don't even subscribe to the teachings of the Quran.
Exactly. I'm 100% in agreement with you. But without a doubt, there are people that come into our country under false pretenses
That is
with
correct.
evil intent.
Mm-hmm.
There are those who say it's our fault. The chicken's coming home to roost. America the big bully. To them, I would like to say, if you don't like what's going on around here, you're free to leave.
The door is not locked from the outside.
Exactly.
All right, Eric, thank you very much for calling in tonight. Appreciate it.
We have some other emails we want to get to right now at this point. I believe we have Renee, if we can pull up that one. She writes that I feel like everyone needs to go home and hug their family members. This is very tragic, she wrote into our station a little bit
Just earlier today, Brian and I were talking about how these comments, they all seem as if they could come from either one of us and anyone else we talk with, and we were such like minds about what's happened. That's the strangest thing happened earlier today. Both of us decided today to wear the exact same tie. I happened to be in a store this afternoon, and I bought this tie, and I walked into the hall, and there's Brian wearing the exact same tie.
Kevin Williams earlier tonight had his American tie, American flag
we didn't
tie
really want to look like we came in with a uniform.
Not a good idea, but the thought is there. It's there. I went to the store earlier today. Everybody was talking about it, standing there saying, that's all I've been doing is listening to the radio, watching television. This is what everybody's talking about. So we're all in the same boat right now.
We have another caller. We understand that Jay from Irondequoit is on the line. Jay, or is it BJ? I'm sorry, it's a lady, BJ from Irondequoit.
Yes.
You want everyone to start flying American flags.
Yes, I do.
Perhaps wear red, white, and blue as ties as well.
Yes, I would ask that anyone who has an American flag to put it out where your neighbors and passersby can see it, and if you don't have one, consider purchasing one and flying it until this horror is over with and these people who are responsible are brought to justice.
Mm-hmm. What is it about America that, number one, makes you very proud, and also, number one, makes you a bit nervous right now?
I am not a bit nervous right now. I feel that the government has things under control. I don't think anything else is going to happen. However, I have a terrible, hollow feeling.
Have you ever had a feeling like this before?
Never. And I was a child during World War II, then the Korean War, Vietnam, the Oklahoma bombing.
It's different, BJ, is it not?
Yes,
when
it
it hits home.
Yes, it's devastating. It's devastating. I just feel such a hollowness.
We share your feelings
Thank
tonight.
you so much.
Thank you for calling in.
Thank you very much for the phone call. Just to update you on some of the facts so far, we've been told Mayor Giuliani says that there are 41 known deaths so far, 1,700 known injuries, 259 uniformed officers remain unaccounted for at this hour. And listening to BJ talk about some of the things that she's never experienced in her life, just listening to we have reports that the cell phones, people called from the plane on their cell phones to loved ones to I guess let them know that their plane was hijacked, they're going down, and some of the things that they said, Says, he called his wife, I know we're all going to die. There's 3 of us who are going to do something about it.
Try to be heroes, try to prevent something.
Right, I love you, honey. I mean, you just haven't ever heard of anything like that. So
we have a call from Canandaigua right now.
This is Michael, I believe. Michael, I understand you think that we need to go and make a statement, if you will. Talk about that.
Yes, my name is Michael Fisher, and I live in Canandaigua now, but I'm originally from Louisiana, where the president went to, and all that stuff. But I back the president with all my heart. And I think we know who did it in 1993, and the same person did this today. There's no doubt in anybody's mind, the president, the LPI, anybody. And if they're not loading the planes with bombs, fueling them up, there's a problem. Do you agree?
I didn't get the last part of his statement, Michael. I apologize.
Loading planes with bombs. I know that President Bush and some of the senior officials in the White House have talked about actions to be taken for.
So he wants retaliation.
He wants retaliation, and there has been an official that is quoted that says nothing is off the table. And somebody said, "What about nuclear warheads?" And the senior official from the White House says, as I said, nothing is off the table.
Well, it's difficult because the appetite for retaliation and for some kind of revenge is keen right now, but it's going to take a while for the investigators to sort out the trail of evidence and, in fact, identify the exact group or groups who did this. So retaliation is not possible until that's done first, and that might take a while. So we have Josh now standing by on the telephone. Josh from Fairport. What is your thought right now tonight?
Yeah, my name's Josh Owen, and I'd just like to let everybody know that my feelings and my family's feelings are out for all of the victims and the people giving their lives to rescue them.
You sound like you're a young person.
Yeah, young. How old are you, Josh?
13.
13. What do you think about what's going to happen next?
I have a feeling that we're going to be going to war, and I was just wondering on, you know, when, how would that affect American soil if we ever went to war, and if so, would it be nuclear war?
Well, let's hope not. It's tough to tell. I mean, it's very difficult to tell. As we said before, they didn't say that nuclear weapons are not off the table.
But I mean, there's no reason to.
There's no reason to automatically think that that's the answer, though, either. So.
But what happened and what you saw yesterday certainly was the kind of catastrophe and the kind of apocalyptic scene that you would have in a nuclear holocaust like that. You see some of the video, and Brian, you talked earlier about the number of people who are helping 1,400 firefighters and others who might have lost their lives trying to help. These are the real heroes right now.
Let's go to Kate in Greece. Kate has a brother who works for U.S. Air and was at Logan Airport yesterday. Kate, hi. How are you?
I'm pretty good. How are you?
Good. Tell us about your experience.
Well, first of all, of course, along with everyone else, I'd like to let everyone know that my prayers and condolences are going out to the families who have lost family members. We had 12 family members to account for yesterday between New York and the airlines and Washington, and thankfully we were able to account for 11 of them.
Kate, the fact that you have family members, I guess your sister is also a flight attendant with United, if I understand correctly. What do you think about the security issue in the nation's airports right now? Do they have any experiences with that at all?
Yes. My brother and my sister. My brother has been with the airlines for 25 years, my sister for 19. And they are convinced and firmly believe that this has been in the planning stages for a few years, that the wherewithal for the hijackers was aided and abetted by aircraft ground workers. My brother can attest to the fact that all the airlines contract out catering, and
there were some loose ends as far as security is concerned, so you've been concerned for a while.
And many of them, the employees at Logan, are identifiably foreign and can't even speak English.
All right, well, Kate, thank you very much. Appreciate your concerns tonight.
Absolutely. We understand there were several callers. We apologize if we weren't able to get to everybody, but thank you very much for sharing your thoughts with us tonight.
We now head back to NBC's live network coverage. Please join us again tonight at 11 as we continue to follow developments live from New York and Washington, D.C.
Good night.
It is the day after the day that no one could imagine coming to America. Recovery teams beginning the grim task of counting the dead as fear spreads that more buildings may collapse in lower Manhattan. The FBI fanning out across the country and around the world, tracking new leads, promising to track down the terrorists. There is word the attackers could have had two other targets in mind, the White House and Air Force One. And President Bush vows retaliation for what he calls acts of war.
This is an NBC News special report. Attack on America. Here is Tom Brokaw.
Good evening again, everyone. I am Tom Brokaw here in New York, and here's what we know at this hour. There is progress reported in the hunt for the World Trade Center terrorists, the terrorists who also attacked the Pentagon and took another plane down outside of Pittsburgh. The FBI is saying it has a tremendous number of leads, and late today, recovery efforts at the World Trade Center were forced to slow down after 4 stories that remained of the South Tower collapsed. President Bush visited the Pentagon this evening, where it is safe to assume that the United States response militarily is being planned. Tonight, we'll take you minute by minute through today's heartbreaking search for those survivors. We'll have the latest on the hunt for the terrorists. We'll explain how the terrorists may have been able to accomplish such a sophisticated, well-coordinated attack. We'll go inside an intensive care unit in the hours immediately after the attack. We'll witness the tragedy of New York's bravest, the city's firefighters and policemen, hundreds of whom are now believed to be dead. We'll have advice for helping you with your children as they cope with this tragedy. And coming up in a few moments, I'll be talking with Secretary of State Colin Powell and Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld. I'll also be joined by Senators John McCain and Hillary Clinton. But let's begin tonight with NBC's David Bloom and the latest on the precarious situation at the World Trade Center. David?
Well, Tom, not surprisingly, given the chaotic situation here in Lower Manhattan, we're getting conflicting reports tonight about how concerned emergency workers are about the possibility of at least 2 buildings in this area surrounding the World Trade Centers collapsing. Let me tell you the buildings that we're talking about. It's very dark here, of course, tonight, just after 8 o'clock Eastern time, but you can still see the lights on One Liberty Plaza, the 50-story building, which is about 3 blocks north of what remains of the Twin Towers. Within the last couple hours, hundreds of rescue workers came streaming up Church Street away from what remains of that complex because they were worried about the buildings collapsing. Now, within the last half an hour or so, we've been told by police department officials that the fire department is now saying perhaps the building is structurally sound. Perhaps it is safe to go back, at least nearby, if not inside. Within the last 10 minutes, we've seen some trucks carrying debris coming back up this road. But we've also seen emergency workers streaming out of here saying, no, we're still being evacuated. Bottom line is, this agonizingly slow rescue effort, if it's proceeding at all, it's proceeding very, very slowly, very, very cautiously tonight, and at last reports, only 4 people, according to Mayor Giuliani of New York City, have been pulled out of the rubble alive. Tom?
All right, thanks very much, NBC's David Bloom. We'll ask you to stand by. We'll be coming back for an update during the course of the evening. But joining us now from Washington, D.C. is Secretary of State Colin Powell. Mr. Secretary, NATO today invoked Article 5, which means that an attack on the United States is an attack on any NATO member. That will give you great military and political cooperation. But what about the states like Kuwait and Jordan and Egypt and Saudi Arabia, who were so critical to us during Operation Desert Storm? Do you expect from them outspoken positions of support?
Yes, I do, Tom, and we've been in touch with many of them in the course of the day, and I'll be talking to more of them this evening and tomorrow. I have been very, very satisfied with the degree of support we have received, not only from our NATO allies, but other European countries, from our friends here in the Western Hemisphere at the Organization of American States Summit yesterday. And as I have called around the Persian Gulf region, I am getting expressions of support. I got a letter from Mr. Amri Moussa, who is the chair of the Arab League, expressing condolences, and I also spoke to him on the phone. And they find this an outrage against humanity. It should not be seen as something done by Arabs or Islamics. It was something that was done by terrorists, and we ought to see it that way, and we ought to rally the entire civilized world against this kind of activity.
Are you sending a message to Afghanistan tonight through Pakistan, and if you are, what is that message?
We are sending a variety of messages to any nation that might have knowledge about such terrorist activity. We're not accusing any organization yet, but there's a body of evidence that is slowly growing. And what we're saying to the Pakistanis is that we'd like to have any information that you might have that would shed light on this incident or who might have caused it. And as we go forward, we might want to come to you for assistance if the response turns out to be in an area where you can be of an assistance. With respect to Afghanistan, we have always told the Taliban leadership that they should not be harboring Mr. Osama bin Laden and a network that he controls. And we're reinforcing that message and also making it clear to them that they should disavow themselves of any kind of involvement with such organizations if they want the world to try to help them with the serious problems that they have in their society and in their economy. And we're doing this throughout the region, throughout the world, wherever terrorists find host nations to take care of them, to give them support. The President was very clear last night. We're not only going after the perpetrators, we'll go after those nations, states, and organizations who give them succor, who provide them assistance and give them a place from which they can launch their terrorist attacks.
But, Mr. Secretary, it's one thing to go after a headquarters of a terrorist organization or even its leader, but when you begin to attack the country that may be harboring him, that can change the political equation very quickly, can't it?
Well, it can, and we will be very cautious in how we might use our military strength. And I don't want to get into hypotheticals, but one always has to consider that. But at the same time, these countries tend to put themselves at risk by harboring terrorist activity of this type. That's why it is in their interest to become part of a civilized world and get rid of this sort of activity and not let it perpetuate and exist within their borders.
After the terrorist attacks on the United States embassies in Tanzania and Kenya, there was a swift response at 2 targets. Later, some question about whether or not, in fact, one of the targets was appropriate. Are you going to take more time this time?
Well, let's first of all determine who is responsible and then determine the best response. The response may be political, certainly diplomatic, and it may well be military. And you can be sure that we will do it carefully, we will do it prudently, and we'll make sure we've got the goods on them, or at least a high probability of having the goods on them before launching military strikes, if that turns out to be the proper recommendation coming from the Pentagon to the President, and the President approves it.
Mr. Secretary, you grew up as a military man in a bipolar world. We formed NATO, the greatest military alliance in the history of mankind, to face down the Russians if it ever came to that. Are we going to have to form more permanent alliances now to deal with terrorism, long-term, not short-term?
I think we do have to form other kinds of alliances. I'm not sure we need a new organization. I mean, you saw what NATO did today. They invoked Article 5 of the Washington Treaty, which was never designed for this kind of purpose. When you look at the spirit of the Washington Treaty, where all of these nations were going to come to each other's aid in time of danger in the event of an attack, this in the 21st century is the kind of attack that we have to be prepared to defend against, to respond to. And NATO came forward today and understood the nature of this new threat, and I think correctly invoked Article 5 of the Washington Treaty. Any nation attacked, all other nations will be expected to assist in the response and come to the defense and assistance of the nation that's been attacked from outside the alliance.
Secretary of State Colin Powell, thanks very much for being with us tonight, and obviously we wish you all the very best.
Thank you, Tom.
Thank you. Let's get the latest now on the investigation from our Justice Department correspondent, Pete Williams, who joins us from Denver, where he was stranded as he attempted to get back from his Rocky Mountain vacation. Pete?
First, the numbers. There's probably about 8,000 federal agents and support personnel working on this investigation tonight. The Attorney General says now that the FBI has received over 2,000 leads. Now, you might expect that magnitude of activity at this point, but what's unusual about this investigation is how far it's gotten, according to officials. For example, by checking the manifest of people who boarded those 4 planes that were hijacked and comparing them against hotel registration lists in Boston, for example, they've already done some searches in Boston hotels, and they say they've found material that's useful in that investigation, technical data about airplanes and so forth, maybe even things that people use to disguise themselves. Now, another lucky break. A man in Boston in the airport said he'd gotten into an altercation in the parking garage with some characters that he thought looked suspicious. He described the car. The FBI found it, and that led federal agents to a flight school in Florida. where these two men who were registered to that car had studied pilot training for about the past year, describing themselves, they said, as Germans, and staying for a time with one of the people who ran that flight school. That in turn led the FBI to search residences that those two people used, their cars, places they went, bars, restaurants that they've been hanging out. So that just gives you some indication of the kind and the magnitude of the FBI investigation. Now, one other thing that the federal agents are doing is looking at email accounts that perhaps the suspected terrorists might have used to communicate with each other. Now, not all the leads have panned out. There was some concern at one point today that some people associated with this terrorist got onto a train. They stopped it in Providence, but they decided there was no connection, Tom.
All right, thanks very much, NBC's Pete Williams, who's been working the phones from Denver, contacting all of his law enforcement sources, and joining us now from Washington is State Department correspondent Andrea Mitchell. Andrea, what do you have for us?
Well, Colin Powell is actually, I think, taking a very unusual tack here with NATO, not having the support, as you quickly pointed out, in the Middle East, going to Europe, going to other countries, Russia and China, who have themselves feel threatened by Islamic terrorism, Islamic-sponsored terrorism, and beginning to try to build a new kind of coalition. Now, this investigation that Pete has been reporting on, I think, has been pretty extraordinary in how quickly they have come together with these leads. Against the backdrop, as you know, of what is widely viewed as an intelligence failure. At the CIA tonight, there was an attempt by the CIA director, George Tenet, to try to rally the troops. He did a closed-circuit video message to all of the thousands of workers out there at Langley, trying to tell them that while they missed preventing this attack, they should stand tall, they should be proud, and they should move onward to try to prevent the next attack and solve this one. Tom?
Thank you very much, Andrea. NBC's Andrea Mitchell tonight. And joining us now from the Pentagon is Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld. Well, we'll come back to that momentarily. We obviously are having some audio difficulties. That was a tape that we did earlier with Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld, who had a number of things that were important to share with us. But we want to go now to New York's Times Square and Dateline's Stone Phillips, who is there. Stone?
Tom, I'm on Broadway at Times Square, the so-called crossroads of the world. Normally at this hour, this place is packed with people, pulsing with energy, and it's very noisy. Tonight, as you can see, well, this is what it's like. The lights are bright, but crowds just aren't here. Actually, it's pretty quiet with all the Broadway shows shut down because of yesterday's terrible events. The people who are here seem subdued, not a character trait New Yorkers are known for. And it's something we've seen all day long, a palpable difference. Whether it was riding to work on a half-empty train, as I did this morning, or walking these half-empty sidewalks, you see a kind of 1,000-yard stare in people's eyes. It's almost as if they're trying hard not to cry.
Dawn, the day after the worst day in modern American memory. Americans wake up to a world changed forever. And on the first day of this new and uncertain era, a soldier turned statesman talks of a war that must be fought and won.
We're mad. We were assaulted. But our spirit wasn't assaulted, and our fighting spirit was not assaulted, so we want to respond. You don't attack America like this and get away with it.
In the debris field where the iconic Twin Towers once stood, 18 search and rescue teams, hundreds of people, have been working all night long, sometimes digging with their bare hands, hoping to reach survivors.
I think anybody that was up in the building, you know, I don't think there's much hope for them, but hopefully there are people who maybe came in on the PATH train or were in the stores below, and they're just kind of stuck. They might still be alive.
Driving those hopes, the incredible story of 6 firefighters rescued on Tuesday from a pocket in the ruins so intact that one of them was said to be surprised the building had collapsed around them. And this morning, reports that at least one other police officer had also been pulled out alive. New York Mayor Rudy Giuliani this morning.
We were able to move 120 dump trucks out of the city last night, which will give you a sense of the work that was done overnight. So some of the debris has already been removed. More of it is being removed, and it'll be done by barge all throughout the day today.
And the question on everyone's mind, how many died? The mayor says he is preparing for the worst.
The numbers that we're working on are in the thousands. Obviously, we hope that's not the case.
At the city's hospitals, the hope is there would be more survivors to treat.
They told me the story of how they've had physicians down at ground zero at the site. One person was trapped and they thought they'd have to amputate his leg. And they were able to get him out without doing that, and he is alive and here thanks to that tremendous dedication.
And that police officer rescued this morning, word now of his heroic effort to save others before he himself became trapped.
He said that as soon as they discovered him, that the EMS personnel at the scene were doing an outstanding job of comforting him. They were giving him water to drink. They were doing, he said, a great job of trying to get him out of the scene, but it was very difficult, very dangerous. He was actually pinned for quite a while until they were able to get him out.
This morning at the Pentagon, the all-night effort merely to extinguish the fires is still underway.
We were never able to fully extinguish the fire in the roof structure. We were able to get it mostly knocked down, and again, because we're having extreme difficulty making access under the slate roof, it's to be expected to take a while to get there. We have had the fuel from the jet catch fire again, and we're now in there with some additional hand lines and some phone lines with aircraft firefighters inside of the insides of the Pentagon, trying to suppress it, this time with firefighting foam.
And even as the struggle to contain the fires continues, the death count begins. Word this morning that the number would exceed 100, mostly from the Army and Navy, and some intelligence personnel. From the White House this morning, another address from the president.
The deliberate and deadly attacks which were carried out yesterday against our country were more than acts of terror. They were acts of war. This will require our country to unite in steadfast determination and resolve. Freedom and democracy are under attack. The American people need to know we're facing a different enemy than we have ever faced. This enemy hides in shadows and has no regard for human life.
As he did last night, the president seeks to reassure Americans that life would go on, but it is going to be different.
The federal government and all our agencies are conducting business, but it is not business as usual. We are operating on heightened security alert. America is going forward, and as we do so, we must remain keenly aware of the threats to our country. Those in authority should take appropriate precautions to protect our citizens.
Across the nation, it is clear things are far from normal. This morning, air travel still shut down, stock markets closed, sporting events postponed, Broadway shows dark, and U.S. military forces worldwide on high alert. Warships patrolling the waters off Washington and New York, AWACS radar planes patrolling the skies. As rescuers toil, another high-stakes effort is underway to find those responsible for the carnage. NBC's Chris Hansen reports investigators are making swift progress.
Authorities may have identified some of the actual hijackers, and here's how they think they might have done that. Yesterday, they got a phone call from a passenger who had left Logan and arrived at his destination. Of course, he saw on the television monitors what had happened at the World Trade Center. He called investigators to say that he had had an altercation with two men he described as being Arabic in the central parking garage near the American Airlines terminal here at Boston Logan. He described the car that they were near, which was turned out to be a rental car, a Mitsubishi sedan. Investigators arrived at the sedan, took a quick look, and they found inside that there were flight training manuals in Arabic. They were able to connect that sedan to two men who are now identified as brothers, both of whom have passports from the United Arab Emirates, one of whom is a trained pilot. 2 to 3 other suspects may have come across the border into the U.S. from Canada and flown here yesterday morning from Portland, Maine, to take part in the hijackings.
And today in Florida, FBI agents spend hours questioning instructors at a flight school and confiscating potential evidence. Their focus, 2 men described as Middle Eastern who trained at the school last year. By midday, reports that the FBI has connected the two with yesterday's terrorist acts. NBC's Kerry Sanders reports the Florida angle is developing quickly.
They enrolled last July into the Venice Flying School, and they really completed their training there in January.
The investigation picks up pace this afternoon, with SWAT teams moving into this hotel in Boston, the city where 2 of the hijacked flights originated. Authorities reportedly looking for material witnesses, people who might have had contact with the growing list of suspects.
They believe they are linked to yesterday's attack. They say that credit cards that these men possess were allegedly used to purchase tickets on flights.
There are local news reports, unconfirmed, of 3 arrests. All we know is 1 person is taken away in a van, and it is unclear this afternoon what, if any, role he had in yesterday's attacks.
And federal investigators are confirming that they do believe that there is an actual terrorist cell here in the Boston area with direct links to Osama bin Laden.
As the search for suspects heats up, distraught family members search for loved ones. Thousands of people still unaccounted for at the World Trade Center and at the Pentagon, where hope for any survivors now seems to have all but disappeared. In New York, a long line of anxious Americans outside the city's Family Services Center.
Didn't really hit me until just now, you know.
I haven't heard from everybody, and it doesn't even, you know, it's like everybody knows somebody, and we're just all in this together, no matter who we are or what our beliefs are.
And from the families and friends of the passengers on the hijacked planes, heartbreaking stories of heroism and bravery. Tom Burnett, a passenger on the United flight that crashed outside Pittsburgh, called his wife, says Father Frank Calaccio, a friend of the family.
Yeah, he called her on the cell phone and told her that one of the passengers was already dead and that they knew that they were all going to die, and that 2 other men and he were going to try to do something, the conversation, and love you, honey, and that was the end of the conversation.
The speculation today that Burnett and his comrades were successful in bringing down the plane short of the hijackers' intended target in this western Pennsylvania field instead of a Washington landmark. On the same plane, Mark Bingham called his aunt and mother.
He just said, I want to let you all know that I love you very, very much in case I don't see you again.
He said that?
That the plane has been taken over by hijackers. And then I said, well, we love you very much too, Mark. Let me go get your mother.
I hope it was quick. I hope he took an active part in thwarting the hijackers.
As the day wears on, fresh evidence of the magnitude of this disaster. Pictures released by NASA show the Trade Center fires so large they could be seen from space. And on this day after the towers collapsed, more scenes of absolute devastation. At 2:30, Secretary of State Powell gives a briefing. He makes it clear that not only the United States, but its allies around the world will be seeking the perpetrators. But as of now, no hard answers.
We have to make sure that we go after terrorism and get it by its branch and root. And so we will hold accountable those countries that provide support, that give host nation, if you can call it that, support and facilities to these kinds of terrorist groups.
Later this afternoon, more unsettling news that the White House may have been the initial target of the plane that hit the Pentagon. NBC's Jim Miklashevsky.
That it circled up over the Capitol and then headed down toward the White House, in the direction of the White House.
White House Press Secretary Ari Fleischer confirms that account, also telling reporters that the president himself was a target, even as he flew with a fighter escort to those military bases yesterday.
That also is one of the reasons why Air Force One did not come back to Andrews, where some people may have thought it would.
There was also troubling news of a different sort today. The first reports of retaliation against Arab Americans. This mosque outside of Dallas, Texas, attacked. Its windows shot out. And New York's mayor registered concern on that front as well.
But we've had a few incidents that appear to have been directed against people because they may be regarded as Arab or or Asian, but nobody should attack anyone else.
The mayor also provided the latest numbers on casualties.
We so far have a body count of 55 people as of about a half hour ago. We were able to take out another person about 3 hours ago, 3 hours ago, a woman who was found still alive, taken to the hospital. So now there are at least 4 people that we've been able to take out.
But with so many people still missing, no one expects the death count to stay so low. Hospitals prepared for a second wave of survivors today find themselves instead waiting. In Washington, Attorney General John Ashcroft outlines some of the facts of the hijackings. It's a chilling recitation.
The 4 planes were hijacked by between 3 and 6 individuals per plane, using knives and box cutters, and in some cases making bomb threats. Our government has credible evidence that the White House and Air Force One were targets. A number of the suspected hijackers were trained as pilots in the United States.
Then at 5:15, another echo of the devastation as the remains of the South Twin Tower collapses and another skyscraper near Ground Zero begins to crack.
Yeah, the building is halfway gone and the rest of it is coming down.
At day's end, President Bush arrives at the Pentagon, an emotional visit by the Commander-in-Chief to inspect the damage and pay his respects to those who suffered some of the first casualties of this newest war. Night falls on a city and a country transformed. Tuesday, a day of horror. Today, in this city at Ground Zero, a day of stunned reflection.
Stunned is also the word to describe the reaction of both U.S. senators from New York, Chuck Schumer and Hillary Clinton, after they surveyed the damage in lower Manhattan today. And there is also word from Washington that President Bush plans to come here. The exact timing has not yet been determined. Tom?
All right, thank you very much. Dateline Stone Phillips tonight in the heart of New York City in Times Square. We're going to go back to Washington now. Our Washington bureau chief and moderator of Meet the Press is Tim Russert. Tim, understandably, the attention of this country is focused on lower Manhattan, the Pentagon, where they're still trying to remove the rubble and the bodies of those people who were caught in that attack, and on the Oval Office, the State Department, and the Defense Secretary's office. But there's other business to be done in this country at some time. How long can it be suspended?
Quite some time, Tom. You know, the whole debate over the so-called Social Security surplus, who would spend it, the president said only during a war or recession. We now have both. The Democrats and Republicans and the President of the United States are embarking on a plan to provide disaster relief and war preparation that will cost tens of billions of dollars, and no one's complaining.
Describe for us the political climate on Capitol Hill today as opposed to, say, just a week ago, Tim.
Night and day, Tom. People bickering about lock boxes, that's all vanished. It now is America under attack. Who is our enemy and how do we retaliate? Tom, people want a disproportionate retaliation. They want to send a message. They realize, however, how difficult it will be, and also the ramifications or consequences if we strike back at Afghanistan or a country like that. What will it mean in Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt? Will it cause incitement in those countries? Very, very complicated. Tom, the White House is working also very hard to underscore how much they thought these planes may have threatened the actual White House. NBC News has learned tonight that the Secret Service physically went into Dick Cheney's office and said, "We are moving now." This is when they learned the plane that left Dulles was heading towards the Pentagon was in fact circling over the White House. And one other interesting note, Tom, we've also learned at NBC that there was a President Bush in the White House during the morning of these events. His father, former President Bush, was actually at the White House the morning of the attack.
And I'm told as well, Tim, that when he left for Minneapolis in a speaking engagement, that the Secret Service insisted that his trip not be completed. Is that true?
Absolutely, Tom. They were quite nervous about him taking part and being engaged in U.S. airspace. A full-scale alert, no doubt about it. They understand now that they must retaliate. They believe they have the unity of the Congress, the unity of the American people, but it's going to take time. It's delicate and complicated, and it has enormous, enormous fallout for not only the Middle East, but the rest of the world.
When they moved Dick Cheney from his office in the White House, where did they move him?
Tom, to a, quote, secure area. They will not comment whether that's inside or outside the White House. The fact is there are facilities within the White House that are extremely secure, that can withstand even an airplane attack. There are also areas in the vicinity of the White House they say can do the same.
All right, thanks very much. Tim Russert, who's our Washington bureau chief. Joining me now is Republican Senator John McCain, who serves on the Armed Services Committee, a leading Republican on Capitol Hill, and of course a decorated war veteran. Senator McCain, let me ask you, first of all, what is your assessment of what the administration has been doing today?
I think they've made significant progress, both in process of identifying who was responsible, and also particularly Secretary Powell deserves great credit for unifying our NATO allies, and is now reaching out to other friends to make sure that they're all completely with us in whatever we do.
The sad fact is that we're likely to have a very high death toll, and once this country gets past its shock and its grief, it's not unexpected that there could be a volcanic eruption of rage in America, but this is likely to go on for some time in terms of military options.
Well, I think that's why those of us that are looked up to, especially the president, is going to explain to the American people that this is going to be a long, hard struggle. Even if tomorrow we eliminated Mr. bin Laden and his organization, there are other organizations in the world today who are bent on the destruction of the United States of America. This is a long struggle, and it's going to require significant expenditure of American treasure and, unfortunately, perhaps expenditure of American blood.
You were a warrior during the height of the Cold War. We're now in a wholly different kind of a war. Are we going to have to rethink how we reorganize our military and deploy it around the world?
Without a doubt. It's long overdue since the end of the Cold War, and we haven't made the much needed reforms. A lot of it is due to pork barreling right here in the Congress as we speak, but now's our opportunity. I think the American people will support such reform, and it's very badly needed, and we can achieve it.
We have learned recently that there's not much appetite in this country, understandably, for ground action in these military operations that put the men on the ground at risk. For example, in Kosovo, there were no ground troops. Everything was conducted from the air. It seems unlikely, to me at least, that you can have a successful war against terrorism without committing ground troops in some fashion.
I think the biggest mistake of the Kosovo conflict was when we ruled out the use of ground troops. I don't know what scenario will be required, whether it's with or without ground troops, but I think the president and the American government and the American people have to say to these terrorists, we'll do whatever is necessary, and that includes all options.
Senator John McCain, thank you very much for being with us tonight.
Tom.
Thank you. Senator McCain told me earlier, by the way, that he's doing just fine in terms of his health. We want to share that information with you as well tonight. Joining me now is Democratic Senator Joe Biden, who is the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Senator, same question for you that I began with Senator McCain. What is your assessment of how the administration is organizing its efforts in the first 48 hours?
I just spoke with Secretary Powell. I think they're doing an incredible job in getting a consensus here. Tom, for the first time in the history of NATO passed a resolution, the so-called NAC, the group that makes these decisions, as you know, passed a resolution saying this is an Article 5 action, meaning that an attack against one is an attack against all. Translated, if we can show, which we will be able to, that this was an asset from outside of the United States that did this, that they will join us in pursuing the aggressor. This is a big deal. Secondly, we have had significant input from moderate Arab states who I believe, and I think the Secretary will be able to put together, will be supportive of whatever action we take. China and Russia have expressed in a way they never have before, because they understand their growing vulnerability, the willingness to deal with these folks and whatever state is harboring them. This is an opportunity. People have talking about, Tom, about our way of life ending. Wrong. The way of life of organized terrorist cells is about to end. They crossed the line. They crossed the line. And the civilized world, I predict you, is going to respond, and I compliment Secretary Powell on beginning this organizational effort.
Senator Biden, I remember very well on the eve of Operation Desert Storm in the Senate, there was a very spirited debate and a very close vote about whether the Senate would support then-President George Bush the 41st in his efforts to get Iraq out of Kuwait. Do you expect anything like that kind of divisive debate?
Absolutely not, Tom. And Tom, if I may say, you asked John a question. John's a close friend. You asked him a question about we wouldn't put troops on the ground in Kosovo. John and I were the ones that had the resolution saying put troops on the ground in Kosovo. This is not Kosovo. The American people have been attacked. There will be overwhelming support. The military understands. The people understand. I would be dumbfounded if a single person would argue against using military ground forces if that is deemed to be necessary.
And this military operation, as Senator McCain and others have indicated today, the American public has to be aware of the fact that it could go on for some time.
Yes, well, by the way, it may go on sporadically, but Tom, we have an opportunity here, if we do this well, and I think we will, to actually unite the world in dealing with this, so we can begin to end the possibility of large-scale terrorist organizations having the succor and support of other nations. I mean, everybody has to understand. For example, the Pakistanis have to understand they got to pick sides now. Everybody's got to pick a side, Tom, off the sidelines, period. And I think that's going to happen. This has never happened in the whole second half of the 20th century. This is a seminal moment. And I think every once in a while, Tom, some group, some individual, some nation goes so far that they crossed every line. The terrorist organization involved here crossed the line, and I think they've signed their death warrant and the death warrant for the ability of these kinds of cells to exist with the support of other nations.
Thank you so much, Senator Joe Biden, who is the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee under the new reorganization in which the Democrats have the majority, reflecting some of the passion that is felt across party lines tonight. There was a memorial service tonight on the steps of the Capitol shortly before Senators McCain and Biden appeared with us. The nation today, in fact, the world, stared in disbelief as mighty American symbols tumbled to the ground, American citizens still stunned at the sophistication, the complexity, and the coordination of this attack. It was not a random act of a lone terrorist, obviously, but a carefully planned catastrophe executed with alarming precision, cold-blooded calculation. Dateline's John Hockenberry has some of the frightening details.
It fits into a pattern, deadly, effective. The Marine barracks bombing in Beirut, the bombing of the World Trade Center in 1993, the attack on the USS Cole in Yemen last year, and even the U.S. Embassy attacks in 1998 in Kenya and Tanzania. In each case, we find a shocking U.S. vulnerability exposed by calculating, suicidal killers looking for a way in. Into a parking garage, past a checkpoint, or right up to the side of a Navy ship supposedly on alert. This attack fits that pattern. But experts agree it also reaches a whole new level of sophistication. As details become clear, there is a degree of cold-blooded calculation here, a calculation of U.S. vulnerability that is quite simply staggering. The calculation extends from airport security in 3 separate cities, to the cockpits of 4 separate airplanes, to the entire civilian air traffic control system, right down to the understanding of exactly what it would take to bring down a marvel of engineering, a global landmark like the Twin Towers. Investigators need to try to see what the terrorists apparently saw at Boston's Logan Airport and elsewhere that gave them confidence that hijackers, armed apparently with knives, could safely board 4 separate jets simultaneously.
What we're talking about is not only having the people have a good understanding of security at our various airports, have those people in a coordinated effort get into those airports, be ticketed to get on board of aircraft that were fully fueled for cross-country flights, and have personnel that were trained in how to fly those aircraft.
Once aboard, the terrorists had an absolute and an apparently unprecedented confidence that they could take control of the planes.
They had a good understanding of what the procedures were on board the aircraft based on the reports that the stewardesses were used to lure the crew out of the cockpit.
More amazing, perhaps, these terrorists also understood how to turn off their planes' radio transponders, giving them, in effect, a cloak of invisibility as they deviated from their flight paths and headed for their intended targets.
This is considerably more sophisticated in terms of access to the aircraft, understanding the crew's procedures, ability to fly the aircraft, and understanding our air traffic control systems.
To pull this off, the choice of planes was hardly random. The Boeing 757 and 767 are different planes, but they have identical cockpits with sophisticated autopilots. To the terrorists, this apparently meant that once they had control of the planes, the pilots were expendable. In fact, as Attorney General John Ashcroft told the nation today, the hijackers were essentially the pilots.
A number of the suspected hijackers were trained as pilots in the United States.
That training is readily available. A cursory survey of the aviation industry by Dateline shows that training, even with sophisticated simulators for the 757 and 767, is obtainable throughout the world. Aviation sources told Dateline today that there are perhaps 70 places with simulators for the hijacked planes. But they also say the expertise exhibited here was even obtainable from desktop computers and flight manuals. In Florida, investigators say they are looking at 2 people who apparently received pilot training and whose names were found on the manifest of the hijacked planes. The flights were well chosen by these terrorists. All 4 bound for the West Coast, loaded with fuel. The 767 weighs 160 tons, including 45 tons of jet fuel fully loaded. A 757 weighs 100 tons with 30 tons of jet fuel. Both planes dwarf the explosive power of the now tiny fuel oil bomb that tore off the face of the Murrah building in Oklahoma City. Finally, whoever planned this attack knew a decisive detail about the physics of tall buildings.
The energy required to bring it down is already stored in the structure in the form of potential energy. All the energy used to raise those construction materials into place in the late 60s and early 70s when they built the structure is there if you could just find a way to release it and let gravity take over.
Mark Loiseau is president of a company called Controlled Demolition. Release a building's stored energy, he says, its collapse becomes a matter not of terrorism, but the laws of physics.
You don't have to go to the top floor. You can go almost anywhere in the structure, and given the right circumstances, you can release all of that stored energy, converting it into what is called kinetic energy. That's energy in motion, and that's what brings the building down.
Yet the impact of the planes alone did not cause that failure. In fact, tall building designers try to anticipate air accidents.
When this structure was designed, it was designed, to the best of my understanding, to take the impact of what was then the state-of-the-art airplane being used in our country, the Boeing 707. And if you noticed that when the planes impacted Towers 1 and Tower 2, the structure stood.
As time progressed, what was clear to anyone in New York City or to the millions of people watching the horror unfold on television, fire was engulfing the building. The worst enemy of a steel-reinforced structure is heat. Extreme heat. Physics professor and explosives expert Van Romero.
At what point was there no chance of survival, do you think?
Once the fire starts inside the building, once the building structure itself, the materials inside that building start to burn, it can race through the building faster than you can run.
Engineers suspect the temperatures inside the crash areas could have quickly reached well over 1,000 degrees, perhaps approaching 2,000 degrees, beyond the melting point of any steel. The heat would have obliterated the insulation around the structure, the fire suppression system. Once this happened, nothing could save the Twin Towers.
When the plane hits the building, the kinetic energy, if you will, or the momentum of the plane hitting the building is actually pretty small compared to the fuel. When the fuel explodes from the jet fuel that's on the airplane, that can really have much more devastating effect on the building itself.
As engineers look at what happened to the building yesterday, they see that the window of escape was in fact tiny. The chance of survival had everything to do with where and when people started their escapes in relation to the crucial impact areas where the planes hit. It took at least 15 minutes for people to make it from the 80th floor to ground level. Those people left the building as it was collapsing.
We were up the escalator about to go out the door when the building collapsed.
If I didn't leave the minute that I left, I would be dead.
For those who waited or were above the area of the crash damage, there was perhaps no escape. In looking at the rubble in Lower Manhattan, it's as though someone was trying to learn from the much less devastating World Trade Center bombing back in 1993. Experts say this attack seems to suggest Someone learned those lessons very well.
They did their homework. Even if there was no secondary explosives in the building, having the airplane hit the building where it did, a large amount of weight above the damaged location, that damaged location being further damaged by the fire, that structure could no longer support the weight above it, and the collapse ensues.
There may eventually be new lessons from this attack for builders, engineers, and designers. Certainly the security of every airport, the entire air traffic control system, even the ability of air passengers to take bathroom breaks will be different from now on.
Perhaps the most chilling realization here is how low-tech this attack was in the end. No sophisticated missiles, no stolen nukes, no exotic biowarfare or chemical agents. The main decisive weapon here was determination.
This attack was a reminder that comparatively simple techniques in the hands of a totally determined terrorist with the right knowledge, sufficient resources on the right day, as we all saw, is more than enough to strike deep into the heart of the most powerful nation in the world.
And tonight we're looking live at the scene in Lower Manhattan, the World Trade Center, the collapse of all but a few stories of the Twin Towers. We're looking at it now from across the river in New Jersey, across New York Harbor. On most evenings until yesterday morning, that was one of the most stunning sights in any urban landscape anywhere in the world. Now, it is, of course, a scene of utter devastation. It is racing against hope that we can find any more survivors in there. There may be as many as 10, 15, 20,000 people who went down with those two towers when they collapsed after they had been hit by the plane. And we're told by people who have been down there, state officials and other reporters, that it's hard to describe how compacted the debris is. When they came down so hard, hundreds of thousands of tons of rubble, and that's all been packed together, so there's very little hope that there can be much airspace in any of that wreckage. As we have been telling you for 2 days now, much of the investigation into the attacks is focusing on Osama bin Laden, a terrorist leader who has been monitored for years, and yet he remains a confounding and deeply enigmatic figure to so many, cold-blooded and calculating. With more on the mind of bin Laden, here's Dateline's Jane Pauley tonight. Jane?
Well, thanks, Tom. The one thing you may think you know for sure about the hideous atrocities wreaked upon this country yesterday is that it had to have been the work of madmen. Who else could conceive of a plot to kill so many innocent people, or to execute that plan by deliberately immolating yourself along with them in the fiery crash? But it could be a big mistake to underestimate the likes of such men as Osama bin Laden.
I don't think he's crazy. He is devious, he is clever, he is relentless, and he is patient.
But he is not a madman.
But he is not a madman.
Judith Miller is a reporter for the New York Times. She's covered the Arab world since 1983, when she was chief of the Times Cairo bureau. Is calling this even fanaticism too simplistic?
Fanatic is actually a very good word to describe them. They are highly motivated, they are highly disciplined, and we underestimate them at our peril.
Understanding them is critical, too. What would motivate a young man, average age of a suicide bomber is 22, to sacrifice his life as an unknown number did yesterday?
I think despair is partly responsible for this wave of suicide bombings.
Because they have nowhere else.
Because they have nowhere else to go. I mean, I have interviewed so many of these young people with so much hope for the future and so few prospects.
Especially the educated ones.
Especially the educated ones.
Dr. Gerald Post is a professor of political psychology at George Washington University. He's also a psychiatrist.
These people are distinctly not psychologically disturbed. In fact, interestingly, psychiatrically disturbed individuals are expelled from the groups because they're considered a security risk.
Many say it's a perversion of Islam, that the Quran condemns suicide. But radical Islamic sects do not call it suicide. In their interpretation, not to act is immoral.
The motivation for these acts is both religious and social. And the The social motivation is a fusion of nationalism and radical Islam.
What did America do to unleash this hell upon us?
Well, according to Osama bin Laden, we defiled sacred Saudi and Islamic soil.
When?
In 1990 and 91, when we sent American and international troops to defend his country against Iraqi soldiers.
Just as the Soviets had defiled Islamic soil in Afghanistan in 1979. Financed in part by his money, the Mujahideen then drove the Soviets out. He needed an enemy.
But he needed an enemy, precisely, and he also had an enemy because the Palestinian people were being, quote, oppressed, and it was the duty of all Muslims to come and rescue them, and the Arab countries were being, quote, oppressed by autocratic, horrible rulers whose rule he also wanted to terminate, and he felt that by mobilizing and training Arabs all over the world and Muslims from all over the world, he could accomplish this.
Bin Laden and other radical factions of Islam frighten many in the Arab world too. They may not represent mainstream Muslims, but they are determined and well-financed. But Judith Miller argues that to persist in seeing them as crazy fanatics is dangerous.
We have to get rid of this image of these people as kind of wild-eyed fanatics who are disorganized and can't get their act together.
Why do we have to?
I think if we don't discard these images and stereotypes, we will underestimate the enemy.
What is it about the American psyche that may be undermining our own interests?
I think sometimes any democracy is ill-equipped because we are open. That is our trademark. We are ill-equipped to fight people who are looking constantly for our weaknesses, for our vulnerabilities, for ways in which we can be hurt.
And joining us now from Washington is former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright. Madam Secretary, the Clinton administration was so successful in arranging peace for Bosnia and executing an air war against Kosovo, but does it now seem clear to you that you greatly underestimated the threat of terrorism in this country, particularly Osama bin Laden?
I don't think we underestimated it, Tom. I think we understood the difficulty of it. We were clearly under threat. I had a lot of wonderful days as Secretary of State, but my worst day was when those embassies went down in Kenya and Tanzania. We worked to deal with it as best we could, and I think that what it will require is incredible determination now to deal with the issue beyond what we were able to do internationally. And I must say that I'm very supportive of what President Bush and Secretary Powell are doing in getting support for international action.
But should you have begun that international action at that time? There were two retaliatory strikes, one in Sudan, one in the subcontinent. Some question about the appropriateness of the target in the Sudan.
Well, first of all, I think that we did everything that we could. I believe we did the right thing in the target in Sudan. And this is a very different proposition. America itself has been attacked on our own soil, and it is unfortunate that it takes this kind of a horrific act to get people mobilized. I have no question that we did what we could, and we need to support this administration now in doing what it can. And the determination that Judith Miller talks about that the terrorists have, we have to have the same determination. And I have very much been following and read your book and everything that has been talked about in terms of the generation that saved us from the scourge of the evil of World War II, and we now have to exhibit the same bravery that those people did.
Madam Secretary, I do think that it's fair to say that there was not much political will in either party during the Clinton administration to commit the resources that were going to be required, diplomatic, militarily, and economic, to fight terrorism. But let's now try to go forward from here if we can. What are the greatest challenges to the administration in building this international coalition of allies? Are they the moderate Arab states?
Well, I think that clearly there is a question how they will behave, and I think that they are in a difficult position since there are extremists within their ranks and that they are concerned about. But they have to understand that they are just as much threatened by terrorism as the rest of us are. And I think, as Senator Biden said, it is important now for countries to make clear where they stand. We are all threatened by this, and I think we have to be very careful not to just decide that all Arab countries or Islam is responsible for this. This is a group of determined extremists who have their own agenda.
There was such a great deterioration of the situation in Israel before all of this happened. Is there any hope whatsoever for the peace process there?
Well, ultimately, it is the only way that we're going to be able to deal with this. And I am so regretful that we were not able to bring that peace process to a useful conclusion during our time. I think that we cannot live in a world where this kind of terrorism is possible and where we don't continue to have hope in peace. This has been a terrible day where we have really all had to and willingly identify with the victims and their families. And America has to stand tall. We have to remain calm. We have to be determined, and we have to bring allies and friends along. But ultimately, this is our responsibility. America was hit.
Thank you so much, former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright. Thanks for joining us tonight, Madam Secretary.
Thank you.
And joining us now is NBC's Campbell Brown. She's at the White House. She has more on the options that are being considered there. But Campbell, it's pretty clear tonight that President George Bush the 43rd is using the model of President George Bush the 41st in building a strong international coalition before any military options are executed.
Absolutely, Tom. They're being very careful not to talk about specific retaliatory options, but we are seeing a strategy emerge from these national security meetings the president is having. And what national security sources say is that's really their only option right now in terms of immediate action they can take to focus on trying to build support in the international community for whatever course of action the president chooses. The president today, we heard that in his remarks, as he defined this as really an attack on the world. And White House officials have been quick to point out the constant contact he's been having with world leaders. He spoke twice today with Russian President Putin, speaking with President Zhang. He's been in close contact with British Prime Minister Tony Blair and Canadian Prime Minister Chrétien. But what's interesting, Tom, based on the information we've been given about who the president's in contact with, he has not reached out directly yet to leaders in the Arab world. And we have heard him make some not so veiled threats to countries who may be harboring these terrorists, but we're also seeing a recognition from the White House that there is only so much that they can do unilaterally, that there really does have to be support from the rest of the world. Tom?
And Campbell Brown, what about the president's agenda in the short term? He's got some major foreign policy meetings that are coming up both in Washington and international economic meeting, and then he's going to be on the road come October.
You're right, and there have been a lot of questions raised about how this affects the president's schedule. He has a huge trip to Asia planned for the end of October. Will he still go on that trip? For right now, what the White House is telling us is that his immediate schedule, given the crisis situation, is on hold, that this is really his top priority. And a few domestic trips have been canceled. But as of right now, he is still planning to go to New York for when the UN General Assembly opens. He also wants to make a trip to New York to the site to visit with rescue and recovery workers there. And for now, they are saying that at least nothing is canceled as of yet. They're going to wait and see how this plays out.
All right, thanks very much, NBC's Campbell Brown. It's an image that will be impossible for any of us to forget for a long, long time, if ever. New Yorkers rushing out of flaming buildings as firefighters and other rescue workers rushed in. Then the Twin Towers collapsed at the site tonight. And now New York's bravest are searching for hundreds of their own, as well as the thousands who are believed to have been in the building when those Twin Towers came down. Tonight, Dateline's Dawn Fratangelo has some of their stories.
The date, September 11th, 9/11, will forever be etched in our minds. It's eerie to think that hundreds of people were probably dialing that date, 911, after the first plane slammed into the World Trade Center. And when those 911 calls started pouring in, New York's firefighters and police couldn't stand around in shock like millions of other New Yorkers.
You guys going back?
Yes. It's our job.
They had a job to do, a job that would cost many of New York's finest and bravest their lives.
Every company across the city has lost somebody. It's hard. It's hard.
As the towers were burning, hundreds of firefighters and police were sent into the buildings. The firefighters were from some of the city's most elite rescue units, teams of 6 who were specially trained in building collapses. While thousands of panicked office workers were running down the stairs, hundreds of firefighters were running up.
I guess it was about the 27th floor. The firemen started coming up into the building. And I just felt that they were very brave, and you know, we were kind of clapping for them and wishing them luck on their way in.
But they were not so lucky. As the rescuers tried to save more people, the towers collapsed. First one, and about 40 minutes later, the other crashed to the ground.
Are you thinking of the firemen because you fear that they were perhaps trapped in the building when it collapsed?
I think they probably were. I think there were a lot of them that did get trapped in there, and I think that's very sad. They were all nice, young, healthy, good-looking guys.
And it wasn't just the rescuers on the inside. As the cloud of debris rained down, it destroyed a command center where 2 of the fire department's top commanders were stationed.
I don't know what to say. We lost people that have given over 40 years.
Our job was never meant to be like this. This is something that nobody would ever figure could happen or would happen.
By late last night, as firefighters continued to battle fires and search the rubble, the numbers were staggering.
We've got over 300 people that are missing that we can't account for. We believe that many of them are gone.
In one fell swoop, entire on-duty companies from fire stations throughout New York were engulfed in the rubble of the collapsed buildings. All just doing their jobs. Now all just gone. The numbers keep adding up. 7 from a rescue squad, 8 from a ladder company, and from here, a captain and a beloved chaplain. For 10 years, Michael Judge, Franciscan father and fire buff, ministered to the men and women of the fire department. Yesterday, he answered the call quickly and died in his line of duty, giving divine comfort.
He had a way about him that just soothed all your feelings and emotions, and it lets you go back to the firehouse thinking that this is okay and everything will be okay. He was a great man.
Support poured in from the neighborhood for the hundreds who simply answered the call. Their fire truck, windows blown out and covered with dust and debris from the blast, now a shrine. The Beatitude reads, "Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted." But without Father Michael, who will comfort them now?
In a time like this, Father Mike would be the one we would all turn to, and they took him from us. It's very, very hard right now.
And in Lower Manhattan, Rescue Squad 18 and Ladder Company 20 together lost 15 members.
This is astronomical. I think right now we're probably all in a state of denial, which is probably how we're getting through it. I don't think this is all going to set it. Right now we're too busy working. Later we'll think about it.
Their colleagues left behind feel they need to do something, anything. So first thing this morning, they boarded a bus heading for Ground Zero to find the fallen.
What do you hope to find?
Just hope to do what we can do, anything they want us to do.
We're gonna go down there and see if we can find them.
Missing are elite firefighters like Manny Mojica, who started out years ago with firefighter Brian McKeever.
Manny and I sat next to each other in Proby School. I always remember his smile. He's a good man. A lot of good men.
It's their second nature. In an emergency, police respond, firefighters rescue, and even after an unimaginable toll, they're still at it.
It hurts so much inside right now, and our main goal is just to try to get every person, every brother, every civilian out of that building right now and let them rest in peace. It's very, very hard. but we'll get through it. We have to.
In the best of times, New York City firemen and policemen have very difficult and challenging jobs, but who ever thought that they would become ground troops in a war started by terrorists? We're going to bring you up to date now on tonight's developments. The FBI is reporting some bold new leads in the hunt for those hijackers, the terrorists. A trail of evidence is being gathered from the Canadian border to Florida and around the world. The White House has confirmed what NBC News first reported earlier in the day, that it believes that the White House itself and Air Force One were the initial targets of the hijackers. The few stories that remain of the South Tower of Manhattan's World Trade Center have now collapsed. Thousands still are reported to be missing in the rubble. Workers of all ages, all kinds of backgrounds, all kinds of financial situations as well. And America's leaders made it crystal clear in Washington today, they are planning, at this hour, retaliation. President George Bush today calling this an act of war. And joining us now is NBC's David Bloom with the latest on the rescue effort. David?
Well, Tom, if those firefighters and police officers are the ground troops, this is clearly ground zero.
What is going on?
Lower Manhattan, where right now, of course, this rescue operation is continuing, Tom. Essentially, what's happening right now is that they are continuing to remove debris from the general vicinity of the World Trade Center, continuing to search for victims inside the rubble. Within the last hour or so, we've seen dozens and dozens of these trucks come through, where a few hours ago, the rescue workers were forced to evacuate because of concerns about one or more buildings possibly collapsing. Those concerns have diminished enough at this hour. The rescue operation continues. In fact, we just talked to a couple construction workers who are helping inside, saying that despite those fears about a possibility of the buildings collapsing, their efforts have continued throughout. They're still hopeful, Tom, they can find small pockets, small areas, perhaps basements, where employees or the rescue workers who are trapped inside might still be found alive. So again, despite the concerns about the buildings collapsing, that effort ongoing here tonight.
All right, thanks very much, NBC's David Bloom, who will remain at the site and bring us up to date. We hope that we'll get some good news out of there, that perhaps more people who were alive and trapped in that rubble can be rescued before the night is out. But of course, with every passing hour, that is a diminishing hope that, that realistically that we'll have to keep in our minds. It's still so hard for so many to comprehend the scale of this attack. The people who know it best are the people at St. Vincent's Hospital in Lower Manhattan, and that's where NBC's Robert Bazell has been since the beginning of this attack yesterday morning. Robert?
Tom, the total number of people who've been taken to area hospitals in New York now stands at around 2,200, and about 460 of them came here to St. Vincent's, which is the closest trauma center to the World Trade Center. With me now is Dr. Leonard Bakelchuk, who is an emergency room physician in the trauma center here. He has been here since the very beginning. Doctor, we see an ambulance pulling up right now. Has it slowed to a trickle?
Well, the slowest time was definitely yesterday after the buildings fell. But today we've had a lot more patients coming in. Predominantly we're seeing EMS workers, police officers, fire department personnel, smoke inhalations, twisted ankles. A few people came in because debris fell on them after
So you're seeing people who are being hurt in the rescue effort, but you're not seeing very many people who are being pulled out of the rubble.
Exactly.
And what's that like for you people who have been waiting here to take care of all these victims and not very many have shown up?
Well, it's really frustrating because some of us have been able to go down to the actual site and work down there. And we want to take care of people. We want to do what we're set up to do. And in fact, when everything started yesterday morning, the first 3 hours that's what it was about. It was about one person after another, as if we were in a war. Just one person after another, and we're waiting.
But then with all these people, and Tom, there was hundreds of doctors and nurses standing on the street here waiting for people to come in. When did it start to sink in that, hey, where are the victims?
Late yesterday afternoon. It was very busy until about 1:30, and then little by little, we started to see a real slowdown.
Now, what the people that are in here now, do you have people who remain in critical condition?
We have, my understanding is we still have several people that are here in critical condition. But for the most part, the very sickest people have either been downgraded, or some of them have been transferred to other hospitals where there's specialized burn units.
What was the toughest case you had to deal with?
The toughest case I had to deal with was a patient that was severely burned from head to toe. Skin was sloughing off. In addition, there were large tears and gashes through the skin, and it was horrible.
Okay, well, I hope you get some more people to take care of. We're all waiting for somebody to come out of that rubble.
We feel as well. Right. Yeah. Thank you.
From St. Vincent's Hospital, thank you very much.
All right, thank you very much. NBC's Robert Bazell tonight at St. Vincent's. We'll keep him on duty there. That is the irony of all that they thought that they would be swamped with patients, but thousands are still lost and missing, and for their families, it is only hope that is keeping them going at this time. The kind of hope that led one mother on a long, poignant search for her son. More on that now from Dateline's Bob McEwen.
Even for the city that never sleeps, it was an eerie night. As rescue workers sifted through the rubble, this 62-year-old mother wandered the streets, hoping against all hope she could find her son.
Who are you looking for? My son, Thomas Swift.
Frances Swift crossed the Hudson River from New Jersey, looking for her son, Tom. He was in his office at Dean Witter on the 70th floor of Tower 2 when the first plane hit the other tower. Tom picked up the phone to call his mom.
I talked to him at 5 to 9. He was in the 2 World Trade Center. He said they were evacuating then. He was leaving then.
Tom had trouble getting through to his wife and asked his mom to let her know he was all right. The news came as a big relief to his sister Kathy. But then, 20 minutes later, the second impact. Kathy, stuck in traffic across the river from the Trade Center, was horrified by what she saw next.
On my way home, I was looking in the side-view mirror of the car, and I seen the building fall. And we were just home all day yesterday, just calling any number that anything was on the TV. And just trying to figure out the time frame of when he called and when the plane hit and when the building fell, and that he should have been out of there.
But then all day yesterday, no word from Tom, the youngest of 5 and the family's pride and joy, according to his brother Patrick.
I'm his older brother, but I looked up to him because, he made something of himself.
Tom Swift was the first in his family to graduate from college, and at age 30 was climbing the corporate ladder. Just 2 weeks ago, the Swifts took their annual vacation together and shot this home video.
Now, how do you plan to go about defending the title next year? We'll just take it day by day. We'll play it as it comes.
By last evening, his worried mother and brother-in-law had decided to come to Manhattan and check the hospitals one by one.
Beth Israel, the latest they had was 3 o'clock, and he wasn't on their list.
Throughout the night, they struggled to make their way around the deserted city, hoping for the best, but fearing the worst.
Earlier, we felt confident because people said they saw him in front of them on the stairs or with this group getting out of the building. But now we still haven't heard. And he wouldn't go up.
Hospital after hospital checked the latest patient lists for Tom's name. It wasn't there. Early this morning, Frances Swift headed home, exhausted, but still hopeful, she says. The new day will bring better news.
Do you have a name of someone you're looking for?
Today, Tom's brother and sister continued the search.
I can't imagine other people walking around feeling the way I feel. Lost.
Just keep going back to saying we'll find him.
That's why we're here.
That's why we're here. We're going to find him.
Use anything to sitting at home and just watching it on TV feels so helpless.
We're going to find him.
And this afternoon, for a moment, they thought they had.
Yeah, they might have found him. Dad. I don't know. Mommy said that Peter called the number and that the number, whoever he spoke to, said that they heard from him and that he's okay.
There was information from his company hotline. It seemed he might have somehow called in after the blast. But when the family tried to learn more, there were no solid answers. Details were murky and few. They still don't know how long it might be before they'll find out what happened to Tom.
And that story, tragically, is being played out thousands of times over tonight in New York City. We have organized here at NBC News a terrorism task force, and assigned to it our very best investigative reporters. One of them is Dateline's Chris Hansen, and he joins us now with the latest on the investigation. Chris?
Tom, it was a very fast-moving investigation here in Boston today. From pretty early on in this case, federal authorities figured that somewhere around 20 hijackers had to be involved in this to pull it off. Today, the question became, how many more people are out there? And tonight, those involved in the investigation believe we're talking about 20 to 40 more people involved in this terrorist plot, many more than anyone first imagined. All day in Boston, rapid-fire developments as the long arm of the law reached out across town, trying to grab those responsible and those who might know anything about the plot. At the Westin Copley Plaza Hotel, 3 people in custody. Police saying those detained were using the same credit card used for the hijackers' plane tickets. The hotel is evacuated as a precaution. The bomb squad is brought in just in case. At another hotel in Boston, police and FBI agents confiscate a car, as well as what appeared to be
Well, that's what you call a technical meltdown. It was an automatic rewind of NBC's Chris Hansen. Let's just go back to him briefly now, he's still standing by on duty, I think, in Boston. Chris, tell us about the last part of that report.
Well, basically, after they detained the 3 people at that hotel in Boston here, they also conducted an investigation at another hotel in suburban Boston, where they confiscated a car and actually found some technical manuals for the Boeing 767, the kind of plane that was hijacked out of Boston here, 2 of them, as a matter of fact. Also today, one of the biggest leads in this case came out of Boston. There was a rental car found. A man who had flown out on a different flight from Boston yesterday morning got to his destination and saw what had happened here. Shocked like everybody else, he suddenly remembered that he had an altercation with 2 men of Arabic descent here. He called authorities back here in Boston. He described the car, where it was parked. They got to the car and they found flying manuals in Arabic. They were able to trace 2 men to the car, link them to the car. They are brothers, one an experienced pilot, and they now believe those 2 men were among the hijackers. They've also been taking a look at the travels of 2 other men who came across the border from Canada into Maine and flew in that very morning. They believe they were hijackers out of Boston as well. There were some items found in one of those people's luggage that apparently did not make the next plane, the ill-fated plane. There was apparently, according to sources, a videotape that had to do with flying commercial jets. There was a copy of the Quran, and apparently there was a calculator used to figure out how much fuel you need to fly a certain distance in a commercial jet. Now, a number of people were interviewed today, including a group of cab drivers who may have ties to the Bin Laden organization, we are told, as well as some people who worked as baggage handlers at the airport. They are going to be talking to many more people tomorrow as they try to figure out exactly the scope of this investigation. Tom.
Thank you very much. Dateline's Chris Hansen tonight reporting to us from Boston. As for the occasional technical difficulty, we'll ask your forbearance at all of that. As you might expect, both NBC News personnel and the systems are under stress. They have been going nonstop since yesterday morning. We're going to go now to the Pentagon. NBC's Jim Miklaszewski is standing by there. Jim, what are the plans for retaliation? Do you have any idea at this hour?
Well, Tom, in a videotape message to the troops, Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld said today, the enemy will be vanquished. And while officials here at the Pentagon will not talk specifically about what specific plans are being considered, they do say in all the planning sessions, Rumsfeld, the military leaders, and other administration officials are resolved to, once they find out who is responsible, to responding swiftly, surely, and in this case, finally. There's a sense here that if the U.S. responds militarily, they will not be the kind of pinprick missile strikes we've seen over the past several years, which have failed to get at the likes of Osama bin Laden, who remains the #1 suspect. But instead, it's likely to be an all-out, broad-based military effort to not only get at those directly responsible, but to get at those who, in fact, harbor and abet the terrorists. A reference to the Taliban, the ruling government party in Afghanistan, where Osama bin Laden has been hiding out for many years. And one of the considerations here, of course, is the zero casualty mentality that has dominated recent military operations in the United States. There's a fear among politicians that once the body bags of American military start coming home, the American people will lose their resolve. One military official told me here at the Pentagon today that yesterday the American people have been vaccinated against high casualty rates among the military. They said any casualties in a military operation will pale by comparison to the numbers that were killed in those separate terrorist attacks yesterday. Tom?
Thanks very much, NBC Jim Miklaszewski at the Pentagon tonight. I'm joined now by Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld, who was in his office when the Pentagon was attacked by that hijacked airliner that crashed into the other side of the building. Mr. Rumsfeld, we have an unusual situation in this country tonight. I'm now told that fighter planes are flying protective air cover over an energy complex in Houston, Texas. It's the same National Guard air wing that escorted the president back to Washington, D.C. Are there a number of missions like that going on in America tonight?
There are. We have a number of so-called cap flights up, and as well as some AWACS and some tankers to refuel the interceptors as well as the other aircraft that are involved. They're over a number of areas of the country. In addition, we have on strip alert across the country at a number of the bases aircraft that are prepared to respond in the event it would be appropriate.
Should we assume that that will go on for the foreseeable future?
Well, no. It is clearly stressful on the force, and what we very likely will do, will as we're able to, we will moderate the level of alert as we go through the coming days and as more information is gained and as we are able to develop confidence that the threat situation has been modified. We've already moved from a force protection condition called Delta, the highest level, down to Charlie, which is the next highest, but we're still at a reasonably high state of alert.
We saw the president's plane yesterday with a fighter escort as it returned to the nation's capital. Is it likely that that's going to become routine as the president travels even domestically in this country?
I don't think so. I think that what we see in terrorism is an attack on our way of life. And to the extent we fundamentally alter our way of life and stop living the way we want to live our lives, the terrorist wins. And I think what we need to do is to embark on a broad, sustained effort against terrorism and not allow terrorists to alter our way of life and win.
Mr. Secretary, is it possible that the military will have to have some kind of a component role in what is obviously going to be increased commercial airline security in this country?
That I would think not. The military or people are not trained to be air marshals. Those are the kinds of jobs that other people are interested in having and sign up for and do very well at. We have a great many assignments, but basically the men and women in the armed forces are war fighters. And they're not policemen or air marshals. They do best that which they're trained to do. So I would think to the extent a decision was made that we needed to increase air marshal forces, that there are any number of people in our country who could be trained to do that and do a wonderful job.
We all took notice today when you sent out a very stern warning to the United States military personnel to handle with great care all classified material. Are you worried that some kind of a military plan could be compromised by leaks from the Pentagon?
Tom, I very carefully did not say military. I said the men and women across the defense establishment and across the government. Every person in government who is cleared to handle classified information has to exercise the utmost care. To the extent that intelligence information is revealed, it will ruin our opportunity to track down the terrorists. To the extent that information relating to military operations is revealed, the effect inevitably is that the men and women in the uniform are going to have their lives put at risk, and people will die because of it. It is a violation of federal criminal law to mishandle classified information. And everyone, civilian and military, in this department and across the government, has to be enormously sensitive if we want to not put at risk the men and women in the armed forces.
Finally, Mr. Secretary, do you have any sense at all on when you may have a final count of the victims in the Pentagon attack?
I think it could be several days, Tom. The situation here is difficult. The fire has very recently been put out. They're now using big cranes with balls to break through to try to, all the floors collapsed where the aircraft entered the building between the first and second floor and then drove through 3 or 4 rings of the Pentagon filled with jet fuel that caused an enormous fire. And until those walls are removed and the side building stabilized, it has been too dangerous to get in there. But today they began removing some of the bodies, some of the victims, and it'll just take some time.
Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld. Mr. Secretary, thanks very much for joining us tonight.
Yes, indeed. Thank you, Tom.
And what can we expect at the airports across the country tomorrow? NBC's Robert Hager has the latest on that from Washington for us tonight. Robert, what is the FAA saying about resuming commercial and private airline traffic in this country?
Not going to happen tomorrow, at least not in any major way. You know, we've been waiting for this for quite a while now. First they said they were going to try and get it spooled back up at noon today. Then they were thinking about tomorrow morning. Well, now we're told it's probably not going to be until Friday morning. There are a few flights that will fly. They're allowing airlines to reposition some planes, and they're going to allow airlines to pick up a few passengers that are stranded to get them on to their original destinations, but not in any grand scale. There are thousands of people stranded all over the countryside. There was one just anecdote of a little town up in Newfoundland, Canada, where there are 1,200 Americans in this little town sleeping there 6 to a room for the second night in a row. And there are thousands of passengers stranded around cities in this country as well. Now, the reason for the holdup in resuming the full-scale flights is not that the airports aren't ready, getting these new security measures ready, and not that the airlines aren't ready in being ready to move their planes around, but it's the FBI and the CIA, we're told, who've put a hold on resuming things full-scale. They just want to be absolutely sure that the threat is over, that it's completely safe before they do this in any big way.
Does that also apply to general aviation, that is, private planes?
That applies to general aviation as well. And now when they do get going, you know, we've heard a lot, there's going to be a lot of different changes in security. Some of the interesting ones, you can pick out so many, but there's going to be enhanced screening, more use of these backup tests where after you go through the screening, then they single you out to put an explosive sniffer over your bag. They're going to search every aircraft before it takes off. There's going to be a temporary ban on passenger flights carrying mail or cargo, so that's a big inconvenience to the post office. And this is almost a duh, but they're not going to allow knives. For the first time, there's an outright prohibition on taking knives through passenger screening.
And Bob, what about emergency cases? People who have to go to a distant hospital to have some critical work done, or if there's a dying relative of some kind, are there going to be any emergency exceptions to all of this?
Yes, I'm sure that there's going to be a humanitarian policy overriding on this. The first day there were a couple of flights that got caught in things like that. Organ transplants. There was an organ transplant turned around and they couldn't do the operation that day as they planned. That was first day confusion. But I think now there's going to be a lighter hand over all this, and there'll be more exceptions for that kind of humanitarian case.
All right, thanks very much. NBC's Robert Hager, who's been on duty practically around the clock, working the FAA beat for us, obviously. Well, that too will interrupt America's commerce, to say nothing of America's culture and business. But this country is responding so magnificently in terms of its patience. We can only hope that that patience will be extended in the appropriate fashion for another 24 to 48 hours. The work of hundreds of medical personnel in this city has meant the difference between life and death for victims who were caught in these attacks. And Dateline's Stone Phillips now has some of the exceptional stories from a hospital that was once in the shadow of what was once the World Trade Center. Stone?
Tom, last night, Dateline producers using handheld cameras were granted a rare opportunity to take you inside the intensive care unit at a hospital very close to Ground Zero, the New York University Downtown Medical Center. What you're about to see and hear, medical personnel on the front lines giving you, in their own words, a real sense of what it's been like to face this tragedy.
This was a very sobering experience for all of us. There were severe burns, fractures, dislocations, degloving injuries where parts of people's extremities and their torsos were literally pulled apart. We saw things that you see in war.
Most of them were jumping from the building.
And you said that you saw two fire trucks pull up, and firefighters went into the World Trade Center, into the towers, and then
they went down.
And they went down.
Whoever these poor souls are, they didn't make it out.
My name's Dr. Howard Beaton. I'm Chief of Surgery and Emergency Services at NYU Downtown Hospital. Many of the people who were here in 1993 couldn't believe the devastation at that time. 93 was really just almost a dress rehearsal compared to the seriousness of this.
How many times have you been up and down these stairs today?
More than I can count. When 7 World Trade Center went down an hour or two ago, we lost power. We're on our emergency generators now. I'm told that we can stay on our emergency generators for 36 hours. And all essential services can run here, including the operating room. All of this right now, the monitoring, the respirator, everything is running on emergency power without any interruption.
As a matter of fact, the GE emergency generating truck, I saw it pull up to the hospital with backup generators in case there's a problem with our backup generators. We have double backup on the generators.
Right.
I've been running, bringing bodies back, bringing them to the triage unit. We didn't bring anybody back alive.
How are you holding up, doctor?
Well, considering about as well as could be expected. It's pretty horrific out there, obviously. Unfortunately, from my standpoint, people come in, a lot of them are not salvageable.
We are staffed to run how many operating rooms right now?
We're staffed to run 3 operating rooms until midnight.
What have you seen today?
Seen the most horrible way a man can treat man.
What I thought I'd like to do is to